but I might make this a bit shorter than what's planned because I have something of a voice issue and there is yet another event later on. But I will try to keep it as I did yesterday and what is so important to me as open for discussion. So I will talk a bit about what I see as the battle for Israel's soul. I will do it in the way I like to do things, which is to put it in a historical perspective and to try to understand how we arrived at where we are. But I will keep time for the conversation between us because I think that hearing you is a bit more important than hearing myself. So I hope we can make the most out of this morning. In my mind, in order to understand where Israel's psyche, soul, identity, we have to look back in time and to look into the fundamentals of the Israeli condition and the Israeli history. The first thing we have to understand is that Israel is unique. That doesn't mean it's great. That doesn't mean it's flawed, but it is unique. Why Israel is unique? Because of 2 or 3 reasons. One, no other people went back to its ancient homeland after 2,000 years to build its national home. No one else did that. 2, when we went back to our ancient homeland to build our national home, we built it under a volcano. And if anyone did not realize what the volcano is like, the events of the last 3 years should have proved to everyone that the Middle East, sadly, the Middle East is different than many other parts of the world. Definitely very different from Europe or North America, but very different from other parts as well. So the combination of these 2 elements, the audacious project of going back there and building a national home, but building it in circumstances and in an environment that is so difficult and so challenging, that makes Israel unique from the outset. But then, what was so remarkable about early Zionism and about young Israel, that we saw that uniqueness and we created unique structures. The Americans like to talk about American exceptionalism. Definitely there is Israeli exceptionalism, and we realized it, and we realized that in order to succeed and live and thrive in that land, we must do things in different ways, in unique ways, because other conventional models are not relevant in this kind of circumstances. So Israel was created, and Zionism succeeded, definitely in its first half century, because we were aware of this uniqueness, and as I like to say, we did not invent one wheel there. We invented 12 or 20. So the creation of the kibbutz, for example, was a unique way of dealing with how do you settle that country when you're Jewish and when you're in the 20th century. The kibbutz was a brilliant idea, not only because of the idealistic utopian kibbutzniks, but because mainstream Zionists who were capitalists and bourgeois realized that they have to fund these anarchistic utopian pioneers, because that's the way to settle that country and build our nation. But it wasn't only the kibbutz. It was the Moshav and Kupat Cholim and the Istadrut and so many other ways. What we had, which was so unique, was unique social innovation. Today we talk about extraordinary Israeli technological innovation, and I'm very impressed by that. Being a very low-tech person, I'm impressed by our high-tech. But the social and political innovation we had in the first half of the 20th century was outstanding. And it was the result of this realization that we are faced with a unique situation, and therefore we have to find unique solutions to the challenges facing us. But all of that would not have worked had we did not create a kind of new, somewhat artificial identity. The people who did wonders in Palestine in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s were not the Jews and not yet the Israelis. It was the Hebrews, Ha'ivriim. The Hebrew identity that was created, forged, just before and just after World War I, was the spiritual revolution that went along with the political and economic revolution that Zionism was. The Hebrew revolution was anti-religious, in some ways anti-Jewish. It even had anti-Semitic elements to it. We rebelled against our religion, against our past, while we rebelled against other nations that oppressed us. We rebelled against ourselves. These young pioneers that I, in my book, describe in my En Harod chapter, were so naked, so exposed. In many ways, they were orphans. They had no parents, no father, no mother, no old homeland, and no God. They went into creating everything anew. Again, not only rebelling against Christian Europe, not only dealing with the difficulties of the swamps and the barren land and the heat and the malaria. They were in a sense an attempt to rebel against what they saw as a shameful Jewish past. They came from the shtetls. They felt that we were humiliated, that our heads were too low, and they tried to bring back a sense of pride and strength that had physical elements and mental elements by reinventing themselves, by creating the new Jew who is not a Jew but a Hebrew. Hebrew identity and Hebrew civilization is astounding in the fact that it came out of nowhere and in a very short time became so powerful. When you look at the diaries of people, when you look at the archives, people just arrive in the land and within 5 years, it's as if they were born there. They drop everything behind. They leave behind the Yiddish, they leave behind the mitzvot, they leave behind religion, and they really try to start afresh as if they had no past, while connecting to the old past. This is why the Tanakh was so important, because they jump in time as if they did not have diaspora life. And by the way, this is one of the reasons they, unlike myself, were so critical of diaspora life. They wanted to believe we had an ancient past, we have a challenging present, and a glorious future. But they totally ignored the continuity of Jewish life in the diaspora. So Hebrew identity was so impressive in so many ways, so inspiring. They were in many ways handsome, energetic, innovative. But it had something very aggressive in it, denying our own past and denying our own roots. But in many ways, that was needed. The good and the bad of that culture and that identity were needed in order to deal with the unique challenges I described. There was no other way to deal with such an impossible mission. The mission was truly mission impossible. So you needed that kind of strong, determined, new, aggressive identity in order to deal with the hardship and with this incomprehensible challenge these people were faced with. I said yesterday, 1950s were in my mind Israel's greatest triumph. Israel of the 1950s is a great triumph of the human spirit. And the 1950s reflected that old Hebrew identity. Because the strength we had when we were 650,000 people to absorb 1 million people, to live through the terrible war, and to deal with all the hardship and the impossible challenges of that period, all of that was based on that old identity. But during the 50s, that identity began disappearing because of the mass immigration into Israel. You could not maintain the old kind of culture and civilization as society was changing. But again, talking of the 50s, I described yesterday in general terms how wondrous that period of time was. But I'll say a few specific things about what we did there. What was so amazing there, that in 1952, a third of the population does not have houses. A third of Israelis live in tents and tin shacks. Within 5 years, 200,000 apartments are being built. And Israel does not only provide housing almost to every Israeli, but it has one of the highest rates of people owning their own apartments, much higher than Britain. So within few years, we do what we cannot do now with the housing problem in Israel when we are so rich. So that was the first phase. The second phase was settling the land. The land was empty because some other people left. And within few years, 400 or 500 villages are being created. And the country enables itself to supply its own foods. And then we move into the third wave, which is industrialization. You have actually a kind of industrial revolution within Israel in the second half of the 1950s. But all of this remarkable, remarkable project, which is really astounding, is based on a manifestation of what I just described about the Hebrews. Because Ben-Gurion's Israel of the 1950s does all these amazing things that he does because it oppresses individuals, it oppresses minorities, it oppresses emotions, it oppresses pain. Definitely, it ignores the Palestinian tragedy. Within a year, we forget about our Palestinian neighbors who became Palestinian refugees, as if they never lived in the country. We also ignore the Palestinians living within Israel. We put them under a military administration. They live within the country, but they are actually ignored. But we also ignore the ultra-Orthodox. We come into some sort of political arrangement with them that becomes what we have today with the youngsters not serving in the army. But basically, they are kept in a kind of Haredi reserve. They are not part of society. They are totally oppressed. But the oppression goes also regarding ourselves. Because those socialist Ashkenazis who were running the place were oppressing themselves. The Holocaust survivors did not have the space to talk about their pain until the Eichmann trial in the early 1960s. Even the Holocaust was almost a taboo. Not only the Palestinian tragedy or the Haredi. Definitely the Mizrahim were totally oppressed. There was no room, there was no recognition of their great tradition, their great past. So many of them were treated miserably. I don't think, like some of the intellectuals of the day, that it was some Ashkenazi conspiracy. But this is the way it was. So what you had in that Israel is amazing, amazing success on the one hand, but with a horrible price on the other hand, with the oppression of minorities, individuals, and emotions. That Israel, that Ben Gurion Israel, exploded in the late 60s and the 1970s. The first crisis was the World War Six-Day War, occupation. The second one was the 1973 war, when we lost our Israeli arrogance and self-confidence. And the third was 1977, when Labor lost government to the Likud. Something that should have happened. You cannot have a one-party democracy. But what happened as a result of these three events is that the old structure that was based very much on labor Zionism, that controlled the state before there was a state, gave it leadership, gave it meaning, and was totally committed to it with its own political and ideological biases, was replaced by a kind of new vacuum. Because when the Likud came in, it did not even do what Thatcher did here with her revolution. They never thought it through. They never had the elite. They never had the cadre, the leadership that will take responsibility of the country their way. So what actually emerged is a situation where the political system and leadership that was so important and so impressive with all its faults was replaced by a dysfunctional political body from the late 70s on. So in my mind, the Israeli Republic, the first Israeli Republic, actually disintegrated in the 1970s and in the 1980s. You could feel it, the crisis regarding the Lebanon war and the high inflation that we had in 1982, 1984. There was a deep feeling of a nation that lost its way. A year ago, Arik Einstein, our famous singer, died. And in my mind, the most moving song he wrote was written in 1985. Hoi artzi moladeti at holechet pfeifen. Oh, my beloved homeland, you're going to the dogs. Now, Arik was totally wrong. Israel is there, thriving, prosperous. But he was not wrong. Because his Israel, the Israel he grew up in and belonged to, was vanishing. In the 1980s, without recognizing it, without knowing what's going on, the great labor was not just a party or a government. It was a civilization. And that civilization was evaporated. It was evaporated. And that was what he was mourning. And that was what was not, again, don't get me wrong, this had to change. But it was never replaced by a new structure that will give meaning and identity and leadership to the country. So within that context, what happens, in my mind, is 6, 7, 8 rebellions. The people who were oppressed in the 50s and before now are coming into the light. So first, I'm not sure it's the first one, you have the rebellion of the settlers. The settler movement, if you want to understand where it really comes from the fact that the national religious, what we call today as Srugim, the old Mizrahi people that became the Mafdal, felt oppressed under the Mapai rule. And now, as Mapai was weakening and then vanished, it was their time. Now they had the opportunity to take over the Zionist project. And to a great degree they did. The settlements were not only about going to Judea and Samaria. They were about asserting themselves and saying, now it's our turn. Ofra is our Encharot. We are the new leaders. We are the new pioneers. They rebelled against that oppressive old Israel that was now weakening and aging. The peaceniks had their rebellion too, about a decade later. Because they, although they were, so to speak, the sons and grandchildren of labor, they were not. The ethos of the labor, of the peace movement, is so different from the ethos of the labor movement, because it was essentially based on the state of mind of the American anti-war movement. What they had in mind is SDS, and what you had here with CND. It was basically a protest movement, wanting peace on the one hand, but also deeply rebelling against the old oppressive structure. And in this sense, it was a rebellion against the conflict. We don't want the conflict anymore. We're sick and tired of it. And we want, by hell or high water, we want to end it. Get rid of it. We cannot stand it anymore. It never had the seriousness that the old Zionists had in dealing with the overall Israeli condition. But then there were other rebellions. The Mizrahi rebellion, which was so justified because of all of what the Mizrahim have experienced in the late 40s and 1950s and even the 1960s. That, so to speak, DDT syndrome. But the shape that the Mizrahi rebellion took place was first going for a nationalist sentiment with Begin, and then when Begin died, going for the Shah sentiment. So that rebellion that should have happened politically took problematic shapes. It wasn't about just getting our rights and our equality. It actually was manipulated by nationalist and ultra-religious forces, sometimes in a grotesque way. When you see how the Shas people took the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox customs and dresses and adopt all that, that's not how they lived in Morocco and Iraq. But that was the Mizrahi rebellion that had its own logic and need. Then, of course, came the rebellion of the Israeli Arabs. Again, something totally. So the old military administration was gone. There was some time of a kind of equilibrium. And then came the rage and the need themselves that, again, was channeled first to the Communist Party, which actually plays a very positive role in the relationship of Jews and Arabs within Israel. But then gradually it went to more extremist forces and to nationalistic forces and religious forces with the Islamic movement. So that was the other rebellion. Again, something that had to happen, but took the shape of radical movements. And then there was the rebellion, in my mind, of the liberals, who again wanted, because they saw the country overtaken, but what they saw as illegitimate forces. People forget it, but the Ma'apach, the control of the Likud, definitely the coalition with Shas, was perceived as not legitimate by many of the old elites. So they tried to stop or restrain the democracy in many ways, using the forces of media on the one hand and the Supreme Court on the other hand. So the liberals in many ways rebelled against the old state and the way it was run and against the new regime by promoting, again, the needed, the justified, the values that I believe in, but working through the court and the media, the unelected branches of the democracy, because basically there was a feeling that the country was taken over by illegitimate forces. And then there was the rebellion of what I describe in my chapter about the Tel Aviv clubs of Israeli hedonism. We were so mobilized for such a long time. We wore khakis clothes for such a long time. We wanted colorful now. We wanted to party. And again, it was totally, and it is totally justified. So we went into a kind of obsession, not only with the nightlife, with the restaurants, with the good life, with the trips abroad. Israelis are so intensively into that. I have a friend, an Israeli friend, who lives in LA and watches Israeli television and says, "What do you do there in Israel? All the time you either sing or cook." All these rebellions were justified. All these rebellions had to happen because we could not maintain the old structure. But almost all these rebellions took problematic shapes or went to extreme. But the main problem is that we never found a way to incorporate the result of all these rebellions into a new kind of setup. We never invented or created the second Israeli Republic. So what has happened? And why is Israel there, successful on the one hand, problematic on the other? Because basically we went for the marketplace. Because we could not deal with the politics, we did not deal with the identity issues. We heard about privatization and we thought this will solve everything. So it began in 1985 with probably the last act of leadership in Israel, except for the Oslo agreements, which was the economic plan that saved us from inflation and healed the economy within a very short time. But then we went into a belief in market forces, in market economy, into total privatization. And the result was a booming economy and an ailing society. This is what we've seen. In many ways, we replaced the city square, the democratic city square, with a mall. The mall became our new way of relating to each other. Within this context, two or three things happened that are very important. One is the immigration from Russia, which saved the country and enriched the country in an amazing way. It had some troubling political ramifications, but it enriched us very much. High tech happened, which created this amazing boom. And all this made Israel a very condensed, intensive economic success story while not dealing with its political malaise and not dealing with its deep identity problems. Peace became part of that as well when peace came along in 1993. We went into a kind of peace and plenty attitude. We believed that we'll have an easy peace, actually very economic kind of peace. We ignored the unprivileged people within Israel, and we ignored a lot of the problems of the Middle East with this belief in the new Middle East and a kind of European Union in the Middle East within a day. But the whole state of mind was basically very much into the economy, into this mall, this very successful mall that Israel has become. In 2011, there was the first attempt in 20, 30 years to deal with the internal social problems. The social protest movement in Israel in the summer of 2011, centered in the Rothschild Boulevard, which is a very ironic and iconic term, was the most impressive social phenomena that we've seen in Israel in a long time. Of all the world's social media to social protest movement, this was the most impressive by far. It was wide, it was civilized, it was not violent, it was not extreme, but it was powerful. It really changed the mindset. And basically what the young people who led it said, is that we want social justice back and we want the state back. We cannot have this market economy and a market state of mind be the only ruling force in Israel. And that had a deep impact on the mindset in Israel. But sadly, these young leaders did not have the intellectual capability to conceptualize their revolution. They did not have the ability to institutionalize it. So the movement as it was, as a political movement, again evaporated, although changing the mindset for good. The mindset is still different. But when it came to the elections of 2013, their great rebellion, which is, in my mind, was the most benign and general rebellion, not a sectarian rebellion, but a general rebellion. That one was never, it was in many ways kidnapped, hijacked, stolen by cynical politicians who did nothing about it. And you saw in the last 18 months how they did nothing deeply to solve these issues. So what happens is that within this deep, deep vacuum, the extremist forces who have a strong identity and have strong political organization took over the political body. And as I said yesterday, the settlers and even among the settlers, you have to understand that probably only a third of the settlers are settlers. The 2/3 are there because they found themselves there. The ideological core of the settler movement is not more than a third of the settlers living in Judea and Samaria. But the settlers and their supporters, their rebellion was so much more serious, more ideological, and better organized politically, that they had the total advantage over all the other forces that I described. And they created a situation where they took over the political system, as I said yesterday, by overtaking the Likud and creating their own party. So what we've seen in the last, especially in the last 2 years, it's a process of several years, but it came to a climax in the last 2 years and to a special climax in the last 3 months, is that this small group that is highly motivated, well organized, determined, and sophisticated uses the vacuum, manipulates all the other forces that are so weak, and actually creates an image in Israel, and sometimes a substance of Israel, that does not reflect the real spirit and the real identity of most Israelis. In my mind, the only way to deal with this, I talked yesterday and I always be willing to talk about the need for a new peace concept and what it should be like. But that in itself is not enough. Because what we basically have to do, and this is the great Herculean mission, is to begin defining and forming the second Israeli Republic. After a 30-year period of this terrible political vacuum, we cannot deal just with this issue or that issue. You cannot just hope that this guy will save us or this politician will be the new Messiah. What we need is a new concept that will recognize the uniqueness of the Israeli condition and bring about new answers, relevant answers to this uniqueness. And basically, in my mind, the outline should be a pluralistic unity or unified pluralism. If we'll just go on with the dynamics of the different minorities doing whatever they want, where everyone is a minority and everyone is in opposition, and everybody just complains that the other guy is after him and oppresses him. If we don't find a way to rebuild a covenant between the different Israeli tribes, respecting their identities, respecting their traditions, respecting the differences, but bringing us together in some sort of new way, then the whole thing can disintegrate. It's actually disintegrated. So in my mind, the challenge, the goal, should be this new alliance, new covenant between the different tribes. And I think that in this sense, what the Americans have, and I'm not an admirer of all things American, but what the Americans have as hyphenated identities is the key to success. Because we want Israeli Haredi, and Israeli Aravi, and Israeli Mizrahi, Israeli Russi, whatever. We want a combination of respecting the differences, giving every minority its space, its rights, its equality, but at the same time, stressing and defining a new Israeli identity that holds all of us together and gives meaning to our life. Because at the end of the day, as I said yesterday, without a narrative, without a sense of meaning, we cannot survive there. Both because of the fact that we are Jewish and we have our traditions, and because we are faced with this unique challenges. Everybody needs meaning. We definitely need a meaning. So looking for the new way, defining our new ethos, and bringing about the new relevant narrative is as essential as any strategic goal. I believe that if we will do that, we can find a way of bringing different Israelis together so we will have much more social justice, we will have much more reasonable life, and we will remember again why we are there and what do we want our precious Israel to be like. A benign, liberal, democratic, Jewish state. Thank you very much. Yes, please. Gershon.
Do you think it's possible to do what you're suggesting, which I agree with you, without ending the occupation? Can we build this new identity and find enough common ground while sustaining the occupation?
Not at all. But again, I think that it's wrong. One of the mistakes we made, you and I, is we said we'll suspend everything until peace comes. That was a major mistake. One, the road to peace is a long one and a difficult one. But also, in order to have most Israelis with you on the road to peace, you need to deal with their problems. You need to deal with the issues. We went into such extreme. We only dealt with the conflict for 30 years or 20 years, and then we ignored the conflict. Now we're dealing only with the price of housing and the price of cottage cheese. Everything has to be, exactly what I said, Israel is so unique, you have to deal with the overall Israeli condition. You cannot just, and in this sense, our politics became really primitive, nearly barbaric. I mean, it's not, you don't need to be Einstein to understand that you have to deal with the complexity, both with the complexity of the conflict, but with the complexity of our life. And one of the reasons lost politically in the 1990s is that it was perceived as rich man's peace. It was perceived as the initiative of Herzliya Pituach to take care of its business. And Netanyahu was brilliant in manipulating the feelings of so many different Israelis who felt left out of the peace and plenty party. Now, the Russians, the Haredis, and the old Likudniks didn't have much in common, but they all felt left out of the party. And he built his coalition, and a bit like the old Democratic Party in America. Ironically, the old Likud resembles the Democratic Party in America in many ways. He built it against, so we have to do exactly the opposite. We have to go out to people to deal with all these problems, while saying, as I keep saying, that occupation is unacceptable, is futile, and we have to deal with it. But there is no way, we have to do both, or it's more than two things at the same time. I'll give you one troubling example from the past, And I don't accept the Algiers metaphor. I think there are some similarities between the Algiers situation and what we face, but limited. But the French Fourth Republic could not deal with Algiers. It was dysfunctional. They had a new government every 6 months, something we are approaching right now. And the only way the French could deal with Algiers was to change the republic, to have a new structure, to have a new leader, and then to deal with it. So the republic will be strong. Now, I'm not saying that we can wait with peace until the whole process will end, but we have to strengthen the structure. And one of the reasons I think we need a gradual peace process is because the Palestinians are not ripe in some ways, right? And we are not ripe exactly because of this, because our political, say tomorrow Yossi Beilin is the prime minister. And he goes to Ramallah and signs the agreement I think Abbas will not sign, okay? Can Israel today evacuate 100,000 settlers or deal with 100,000 settlers? No. The army won't do it. The government will not do it. We cannot do it. So we need a gradual peace process for several reasons. One of them is to get started, to go on the right track, but actually build ourselves and reform ourselves. So when it comes to the real difficult part, we'll be a different Israel, because today's dysfunctional Israel cannot do it. Yes, please. You?
Thank you very much. Is the issue described of disintegration an over-reliance on proportional representation as opposed to a more hybrid system you see
I cannot quite understand.
Okay. Is the issue described disintegration? Third time lucky. Is the issue described of disintegration an over-reliance on proportional representation as opposed to a more hybrid system which could act as a stabilizing influence in society? And what do you think about the unity of the left, which you've seen in recent weeks, to battle, let's say, the strong right-wing settlement?
I'm not sure I understood the first part of the question, so I'll answer the second part, but then...
Please repeat the question. Please repeat the question
Okay.
into the mic.
Oh, this one is very difficult to repeat. Okay, so give me a 10-word question.
Changing the electoral system to a hybrid system is what he's asking.
What?
Proportional representation and direct representation.
Oh.
Electoral.
Electoral. And then the second one was, okay. Look, again, the problem, what happened within this, may I answer a question? One of the things we tried to do in the 1990s was deal with the electoral system. And it didn't work. The result was exactly the opposite of what we expected. We wanted stronger parties, we got weaker parties, and a fragmented system. So first of all, we are burnt by that trauma because we put so much energy into trying to change the system, and then we had to change it back. But although I think we need electoral reform, and I'm not sure that your system is the one that suits us, but we need a reform, no doubt about it. But we need to change, first of all, the culture, the political culture. Because just the technical solution, for too many years, Israelis have a tendency to be bitsuistim, to deal with the mechanics. Give me the problem, I'll solve it to you. So for 20, 30 years, people were talking about electoral reform, but the political culture was just going bad throughout this time. So eventually we will need a reform, but I don't see that we can begin with that. I'll give you an example. I don't think we don't have a constitution. I know in Britain it's not the big issue. But for many other countries it is a big issue. Why don't we have a constitution? We cannot now begin with a constitution, okay? Where we are. We need this new kind of ethos, this new kind of culture, and a new kind of movement that it will eventually lead to peace, and eventually will lead to electoral reform, and eventually lead to a constitution. We cannot begin with that. What I would try is to find all kinds of laws that can be passed, I don't want to bore you with the details, that can upgrade the system as it is, with not the major dramatic changes, but there are a few things, like there is the law that the winner, the party that has the most seats in the elections, the leader of that party is the one who is the prime minister. It's a very simple law that creates immediately a change in creating a bigger bloc, okay? I will totally change the primary system in Israel, which is totally corrupt. One of the troubling things about Israeli politics right now, is that the primaries that we have, like what you'll have in the Likud Thursday or Wednesday, are totally corrupt. But then you have internal dictatorship parties. Lieberman, Lapid are unacceptable parties for me. It's one person, one decision maker, no internal democracy whatsoever. So you have these two extremes. The primary system is totally corrupt, and the alternative is totally, in my mind, unacceptable. So I will do a primary law that will deal with that. I think that you can do you take certain actions on the electoral system that do not bring a new system, but improve the present system, and then deal with the fundamentals of the system later on. Talking about the left unity, the new alliance between Herzog and Livni, that was, I think that's a great step in the right direction. Again, I don't see a messiah. I don't see a leader I don't think we should wait for the great leader who will save it from all from this swamp that we are in. But I think that Herzog and Livni took a courageous act, especially Herzog. I mean, he was the greater person here. He was noble. He was generous. He saw the larger cause. He paid a huge price personally, and I think that so far it worked. Because we don't know what will happen, but the beginning of this campaign is more promising than previous campaigns because you have the beginning of this two-party race. And if we'll have two bigger parties, if that dynamics will develop, I think it gives a reason for some hope. It can go bad any moment. I don't know everything is so liquid. Everything is so unstable, you don't know what will happen. But I can tell you that when I've heard the news about that alliance, and I've heard it a few days before it was in the papers, that was one of the more hopeful days that I had regarding this election campaign, but I do not know what the future holds. We need a woman. Yes, please.
I have to vote in March. Sorry. I have to vote in March.
So you are not of the ones who have to vote in May?
Sorry, May. Sorry, March.
March, okay. There's some people here who have to vote in May.
Yes. I look to all the parties and I do not see any policy. What you're talking about is the need for an ideology. What you're talking about is the need for concepts. What you're talking about is real, practical policies that can be put into practice. The technical details of how we will balance the elections are technical. We need people with ideology, we need people with concepts, and we need people who will be able to put these concepts into practice. If I go back and I look at Tony Blair, when he came into power for the first time, my question is, how do we build ideology?
You're right on. I mean, did you hear the question? The statement was that she doesn't see any ideology, just in the Israeli politics, and the question was, how do we build serious ideology? So first of all, you're totally right. And again, being now in my life as I'm no historian, but in my life as a kind of amateur historian, one who's obsessed with history and reads a lot. You know, one of the things that has to do with what I described about the 1950s, one of the things that make you inspired and saddened is when you read the protocols of discussions of Zionist leadership and Israeli governments 70 years ago, 100 years ago, 40 years ago. And you compare it to what we have today. You know, Ben-Gurion was perceived as an autocrat, as almost a dictator. But Ben-Gurion had to convince the political committee of the labor movement, in which there was a vote. Sometimes he lost. And when you read the protocols, you see the depth of the discussion for 5, 6, 7 hours. These people, serious people, doing serious thinking and having serious debates. So of course there was the politics and personal, egos were not invented in 2005. But you compare it to Israeli politics of the day? I mean, no one remembers one report in Israeli media about a meeting of the political body of a party to discuss an ideological matter in recent memory. I'm telling you, we are in a new barbaric age. I'm not joking. What we have, the way politics works now, is you have the face of a person, they do some work on his sound bites and voice. He goes to a PR agency, they invent a slogan, there are 5 sound bites, and that's election. And actually someone wrote, not in the papers, but some think tank in Jerusalem wrote something very serious, which I totally agree with the other day, that this is a very leftist think tank. And they said this Rak lo Bibi thing, I mean, enough of this. Because Bibi at least has an ideology. You know, there are some question marks, but you know generally where he stands. He took the time to write a book before he went to politics. I don't remember, except for Yossi Beilin, who of our leading politicians took the time to write a book or to do some serious thinking. So just to have Rak lo Bibi, it's such a manifestation of the vacuum, the intellectual vacuum. Now these are supposed to be Israel's best intellectuals, the most brainy people. Where is the thinking? Where are the ideas? Where are the concepts? And the example, I'll give you an example that might make people laugh here. My hope, my vision, it's not my vision, my hope, is that we'll go through a process that a certain lady in Britain went through, a lady whose ideology I really don't share, and I didn't like. But when you look at the process that Thatcher went through in the 70s, before she went into process, with all the think tanks they did, where was Britain in the 1970s? They were doing their thinking. So when she went into office, she had it all in her mind, and she had it all ready. There are so many people who come to save Israel, they never cared to sit a week, not only 3 years, to learn the data, to do the thinking. And I'm sure, I think I might be naive, but I don't think I'm naive. I think ideas matter. Ideas matter, even in this day and age. And if people will feel that we've done the work, we've dealt with the complexities, we've brought back this kind of social, political, intellectual innovation, I think they'll respond. They'll see that there is something serious. This is so shameful. This is so shameful. For 20, 30 years, we've been just anti-settlers, which we should be, anti-occupation, which we should be, anti-Bibi, which we should be, but anti. No one votes. No one buys that. So it's so weak. It's so unimpressive. It's so unconvincing. So I think that we need. I can tell you that I'll be doing my best on my own to try to help with this process. But I think this is essential. So these elections are too early, and therefore it's too early for this to be. But we have to be ready, because one of the two will happen in these elections. If the right will win, it will be the extreme right. And then we'll have such a horrific government that we better prepare an alternative quickly that will stand there. because the deterioration will be very quick. And we cannot be just a protest movement. If there is a reasonable government, it still will be weak and messy and problematic. So it will need our support, a kind of intellectual and conceptual and ideological support from outside. And when I talked yesterday about the need for civil leadership and a kind of civil movement that's not a new party, that will support the positive and constructive forces in Israel, that's what I mean. We have to prepare for the day and the year after the Israeli elections. Yes, please.
On a world scale, unfortunately, Israel has become more and more isolated. How much do you think this affects the Israel? On a world scale, unfortunately, Israel has become more and more isolated. How do you think this affects the internal Israeli psyche?
The question is how does the isolation of Israel affect the Israeli psyche? Sadly, up until a few months ago, I would have said not at all. Israelis, again, as I said, we are victims of our success. We lived in this bubble, high-tech, economic boom, good life, blue skies, the wall separating us from the Palestinians, Iron Domes defending us, the Shabak, the Air Force. It all enabled us to live in this bubble, ignoring the Middle East, ignoring the Palestinians, and ignoring the world. So people would read some reports about some problems, but this is overseas. It's not very important. I think that in the last few months, there is a gradual realization that this is an issue. I can tell you, just between us, that in some of the focus groups and the internal polls that the parties are taking now, people are still ignoring the conflict, but there is some sign that people are noticing this process and are somewhat troubled. Not enough, not enough. But I think that the key, one of the, and I've been an advisor to the center-left parties in Israel, I would begin with this. Because I think at the present moment, it's very difficult to convince people to take the leap of faith and do the overall peace with the Palestinians. They're not there, they were burnt, they're traumatized by the failures of the past. But if we will begin by making peace with the West, making peace with Europe and America, and making peace with the Jewish diaspora, not only making peace, saying that for our alliance with the Jewish diaspora, we must change. I think this has a chance because people are not enough aware, but they've heard about it. So again, if I was running for office or advising someone running for office, I would make that the issue. I would make the issue having a benign, prosperous, democratic Israel, and that in order to have it, you need the alliance with the West, and therefore we have to change our ways, definitely regarding occupation, but regarding some other church and state and other matters. So, although it's not ripe yet in Israeli consciousness, I think it's appearing, and I think it's a potential in order to bring about a profound change in Israel. Let's take last two questions. Yes, please.
Are we one people? And I say this in the context of your poetic bit in your book about coming to England, saying really there's not much future, many generations' time. Are we one people? And if in 4 months' time we have a first Jewish prime minister since Disraeli, what would you want to see his role be in the battle for Israel's soul?
Again, I didn't understand the end.
If in 4 months' time there is the first Jewish prime minister,
I heard about the guy.
What would you say should be his role, and indeed the community's role, in the battle for Israel's soul?
Are you on his team? So let me, the first question, I'll be actually talking about in the next session that we'll have here in a few hours. So definitely I believe we are one people, but let me talk about it with all the differences. And again, what I said about the reality in Israel is true about diaspora and Israelis. We have to recognize our differences. We have to see that everybody is legitimate. We have to be concerned about everybody's future, but we are one. We are like, it's not the same body, but we are really the same family. So we are brothers, and we depend on one another, and we come from the same place, and we should be concerned about each other while being concerned about each one about, again, while recognizing the differences. I think that if, I would say it about the next British Prime Minister, whether it's Mr. Cameron or Mr. Miliband, I hope and pray that the new approach will be not to be indifferent on the one hand about the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, but on the other hand, not to be naive and unrealistic. If the approach would not be to hammer Israel or totally ignore its faults, but the approach will be caring, loving, and actually offering decent, moderate Israelis a real partnership in creating the change, that will have a huge impact. Huge impact. Definitely, if it will be, I'm not into your politics, but definitely if it will be Mr. Miliband, he has his moral dimension and he has his Jewish background, that will give it a special meaning. But I think the same applies to Mr. Cameron and to any decent European leader. I think that the way that Europe and Britain, I wish, because I'm such an Anglophile, I think the United Kingdom should be leading Europe in a kind of a different approach, which says occupation is unacceptable, but intimidation is unacceptable too. So we stand by you Israelis, and we are not into preaching, we are not into moralizing, we are giving you our hand, and we'll go with you hand by hand in this dangerous process of ending occupation, because it must happen, but we realize how dangerous it is. If what the message that will come from London will be a message of real care, of realism, and at the same time a moral message that in order to save Israel's soul, Israel must end occupation, that will resonate in Israel, and that will have a real to changing the dynamics within Israel. At the end of the day, if Europe will recognize its historical responsibility regarding the Jewish people, if Europe will recognize that the need to have a safe, prosperous, Jewish democratic state is a European need, because Europe cannot take the risk of another Jewish catastrophe. It cannot. It's immoral. So if Europe will take the new attitude that you must change, you must end occupation, but we'll be there for you and we'll be there with you while you do it, that will have a dramatic, dramatic impact on Israel, and that will be the real contribution of that Britain will have in bringing about what will, at the end of the day, be. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
That was
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've the head slip the turf, man.
And I'm in Tosh Moyao, so that's okay.